I see some people trickling in. Welcome to the LMA session. We'll be starting in a few minutes. We'll let people log in and get ready. We have about a minute or two. We'll let people come in. Thank you to those of you joining us. We'll give another minute or so to let some more people join our session. I see a lot of people coming in. It's officially started at 12 o'clock, but we'll give another minute. All right, perfect. All right, thank you all for joining us today for Matt Plummer's session on a practical roadmap to exceptional critical thinking. It is part and thanks to Key Media, the 2022 Platinum sponsor of LMA Canada's educational programming series. After reading his article, A Short Guide to Building Your Team's Critical Thinking Skills, that was published in the Harvard Business Review, I knew we had to get Matt to come and present to us. He's the founder of Zervana and author of the article. And according to their research, critical thinking is one of the most in-demand soft skills among employers, with demand rising 158% in 3 years, with 49% of employers rating their employees' critical thinking skills as average or worst at best. We think today's session will be a must-watch for most in our membership and for their teams. I would like to formally welcome Matt Plummer, the founder and CEO of Zervana, to join us today. His company is dedicated to helping ambitious professionals excel at work and life by making holistic professional development easy. Zervana's online platform identifies the most important research-backed behavior that are most likely to save you time and improve your performance, and make it simple for you to turn those behaviors into habits. They help people develop the soft skills, including email management, prioritization, focus, stress management, today's critical thinking session, motivation, and people and team management. They do this through developing a wide array of resources, coaching, corporate programs, and seminars. Matt would love your engagement today. So if you have comments or questions, please add them to the chat. He's running this as a bit of a workshop, so he'll be having some stuff for you guys to do while you're attending the session. And we would also love to spend a little time after his seminar answering any questions you have. So again, feel free to add those to the chat and we'll try and address those after. Now I'll turn this over to Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Morgan. Great to be with you all. Excited to have this opportunity to share with you. And as Morgan said, yeah, I would love to be able to respond to any questions or comments you have as we go throughout. So please drop those in and I'll either try to jump in and kind of answer them in the flow of things or at the end. So I want to start with kind of my story of why critical thinking is important to me, how I kind of got into this. And then basically I'm going to move through why is critical thinking important? What do you need to be able to develop critical thinking? And then I'm going to do a deep dive on 1.5 areas and give you specific tools you can use to grow in, specifically around making robust recommendations or decisions. And then we'll end with some questions for you to consider as you think about the next 6 months and growing in your critical thinking skills. How can you structure that development plan and development pathway? So that's the roadmap for today. Let's go back to the beginning of where it started for me. So I was a strategy and management consultant at a big consulting firm, a spin out of Bain & Company, which maybe you've heard of. And I was managing teams there. And what I found was that when I told my team members, okay, I need you to do this analysis, I need you to do research on this topic, whatever it might be, they largely did good work. But when I wanted them to think in the way and at the level that I was thinking, that's where I ran into problems. And it was hard for me to figure out, how do I articulate what I'm trying to get you to do? And how do I get you to think better? Like it just felt very abstract, very conceptual. And so I started exploring this idea of, how do I get them to think independently and think at a higher level? Fast forward about 2 years, I had started Zarvana. I was coaching some managers at a technology firm, technology company, and they expressed the same thing. They said, we're struggling to get our team members to think independently. And that was the beginning of taking thoughts that I had begun to compile and acquire over the course of my own experience of trying to figure that out for myself, and put that into something structured. Because what I found is that we need, as day-to-day managers, I'm not an academic. I'm not interested, not that there isn't value in this, but I'm not interested in creating some academic theory that lives on the shelf somewhere. I'm trying to think about, how do I help people who are in their day-to-day work do this? And so came up with a roadmap that gives you 4 phases and practical steps that guide you through, what does it look like to grow in critical thinking? So that's what we're going to be going through today. But let's start with why critical thinking is important. And I'm going to share my screen here. So a practical roadmap to exceptional critical thinking. Let's jump in here. So why does critical thinking matter? And I'm guessing if you're here, like you're already somewhat convinced that critical thinking matters. So I'm not going to try to oversell this point. And Morgan, in fact, shared some of the data points that validate that. But the way that I think about it, and the way that I talk to people about this, is that critical thinking is the headwaters, by which I mean it's where things start. The quality of your work, the quality of your communications, the quality of your writing, the quality of your decisions, it all flows from the quality of your thinking. And so if you're able to think effectively, think critically, think robustly, then everything else that you do is going to be improved. It's going to be better than it would be otherwise. And so critical thinking stands at the source of the quality of the rest of your work. Here are some stats that Morgan kind of alluded to, but these are pretty surprising, in fact. And so what they found is, when they tested people on critical thinking skills and then watched the outcomes in their life, what they found is that those who have higher critical thinking skills are less likely to experience job loss in the last year, 10% versus 5%. So 50% difference. And they're also, people who have higher critical thinking skills are more likely to work in skilled occupation after graduation. So they're able to grow into jobs that they would like to pursue. And then here's the really startling thing. I'm doing a training with a company right now, and one of the senior vice presidents, what he said is, at the end of the program, he said, I'm excited to apply this to my work, and here's my specific, he built a 6-month development plan like you'll do a bit of today. But what he said is, but I'm actually even more excited to apply this to my life and my personal life. And that makes sense, actually, because what they found is that people with higher critical thinking skills have fewer negative life events than those who have lower critical thinking skills. And in fact, when they look at the impact of critical thinking versus IQ, they find that critical thinking matters more to negative life events than IQ does. So you could have a great IQ, and that might help reduce your negative life events somewhat, but having stronger critical thinking skills actually matters more. And so the good thing is that, you can build and grow your critical thinking skills. And I wouldn't be teaching this if I didn't think that were true. But the problem is, and the problem, maybe that you've experienced, is that it's hard to figure out how to grow our critical thinking skills. And nothing kind of proves that more to me than looking at liberal arts colleges, which are designed, at least, in theory, to teach us how to think, and to see that the data suggests that actually they're not all that effective at improving critical thinking skills. And so it's no wonder that people come out of school, go into work, and not feeling like, oh, I don't really know how to think critically. I don't know how to grow from where I am today, whether that's at a strong point or a weaker point. And so we're coming into the workplace, and we're not necessarily knowing if we are good critical thinkers, and we're not knowing what we can practically do to go forward. So what do we need to have in our pockets and in order to grow in critical thinking? Well, I think there are four things. So four things that we need. And here I like to think about it as a journey because it's not like you're going to go to this session today and that you're going to leave tomorrow and be an amazing, much better, critical thinker. It's a journey that you have to go on where you make small changes to your behaviors and you do that consistently over and over again. And so if we think about this as a journey, the first thing that you need is a destination. So up here on the top of this mountain here, a destination, by which I mean you need to know, what does good critical thinking look like? What are you trying to aspire to? Because if you don't have a vision of what that looks like, then you'll never know if you've gotten there. And then what you need is you need a map. So you need to know how to get from where you are today to where you're trying to go, to that destination. Then, in the same way, if you were hiking, you might need a backpack, you might need kind of hiking sticks and an association of other tools. You need tools that help you get from where you are to the next step on the journey and then the next step. And so you need tools. And then finally, you need what I've called here miles, maybe more appropriately, since I think at least most of you are in Canada, it'd be kilometers. But the idea here is that you need practice. You need to do it over and over again, because through that is where we build mastery and build expertise. And so those are the four things that you need. You need a destination, you need a map to know how to get to the destination, and then you need tools to get from one step to the next. And then you just need time, repetition, and practice. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to articulate a destination. I'm going to give you the map, and then we're going to talk about one or two tools. And you'll get a little bit of practice today, but not a ton, because obviously we don't have an enormous amount of time to do that. So let's jump in with the destination. And by destination, I mean, how do we define critical thinking? Well, I looked at probably 10 to 15 different academic answers to that question. And some of them are insanely long in terms of how they define critical thinking. And again, I'm focused on what is a practical definition that can influence your day-to-day work, where you can actually think, okay, did I exhibit critical thinking or not? And have a simple definition at hand. And so what I came to by synthesizing those definitions is that critical thinking is providing a robust answer to a question. By robust, it means that it's disciplined, it's corrective, like it analyzes and looks at weaknesses, it judges itself, and is critical of what might not make sense. It is intellectually disciplined. So those are all quotes from the longer academic definitions. And then by answer to a question, it means that it's not just kind of a random thought. It's directed at a specific purpose. It's trying to answer a question. It's trying to focused on, making a decision or presenting a recommendation. It has purpose to it. And so you can ask yourself, okay, when I send that email, when I present that recommendation, when I do a presentation on a marketing plan for the client or for our law firm, did I provide a robust answer to a question? And that will also help you think about, well, what is the question that I'm trying to answer? Did I actually answer that question? And then did I answer it in a robust way? So that very simply is where we're trying to go. We're trying to be people who provide robust answers to questions, where we actually answer the question and our answer is robust, it's rigorous, it's thoughtful, and it's strong in the sense that it doesn't contain logical or other types of weaknesses. So that's the destination. Now let's talk about the map. So the map, as I alluded to earlier, it contains 4 different phases of critical thinking. So the 4 phases, starting at the bottom here, is execute. So execute is the ability to translate instructions into action and do what is asked of you. And you might think, well, that doesn't sound like critical thinking. That just sounds like, doing your work. I get what you're saying, but at the same time, if you look at what causes most projects to be delayed or to fail, they are miscommunication or misalignment on what the original assignment is. And so the idea that we can hear what someone else says, understand it comprehensively, and then translate that into actual actions that lead to that outcome is actually a serious requirement for thinking, and involves a lot of critical thinking. And so execute might feel like table stakes for you all, but this is often where people get stuck and they actually aren't able to progress to the later phases at the level that they would like to, because they haven't really been successful at this phase. And so that's phase one. Phase two is synthesize, where you are able to identify what's important, what is not important, and then you're able to combine what's important in a way that creates new meaning. And if you're like, I'm not really getting these exactly, we're going to talk in more detail about all of these, so don't worry. But this is just kind of orienting you to the four of them. So synthesize is phase two. Phase three is recommend, and that's where you're determining the path forward. You're making a decision. You're presenting what you think should be done in a certain situation. That's all about decision making. It's about evaluating your criteria. And then the last phase is phase four, which is generate. And that's where, in phase three, recommend, you're probably doing a lot of analysis, and you're basing largely your decision on data that you know and past experiencing, benchmarking, what have other people done. When you get to generate, that's where you're actually, what has been done before is not sufficient to what the needs of that situation. So you're dealing with an intractable problem that you can't solve. You're having to come up with a novel idea or novel campaign. And so how do you generate creative ideas, creative problem solving, things that come up that are novel? That means they're both valuable and new. And so those are the four phases. What I want to say about these phases is, one, that they are oriented in a directional way, by which I mean, yes, you kind of largely move from execute to synthesize to recommend to generate, but it doesn't mean that if you haven't fully mastered execute, that you can't be, operating at some level of competency in recommend. So your journey through these phases is not perfectly linear. You might be strong in a few areas on recommend, and really weak in a few areas on synthesize, and that's totally fine. But directionally, you'll move through that. The other thing that I'll say is that a lot of people are like really, drawn to the generate phase and like, oh, that's where I want to focus. And inevitably, when we have a 12-week program that we do with companies, and I ask people in the beginning, where do you want to focus? Most people say generate. But then after they've gone through the program, I ask them that again when they're building their 6-month development plan. And oftentimes it changes. And that's because they realize that the generate phase, and this might be different if you're trying to develop creative marketing campaigns and that's like your job, but a lot of people actually their job does not require them to operate in the generate phase on a day-to-day basis. So that might be, every once in a while, every once a month. So I just say that because generate kind of feels like cool and attractive, and there's an appeal to it. But I want to temper your enthusiasm on that and say that a lot of your day-to-day work is actually more in phases 1 through 3. Okay, so those are the 4 phases. What we did then is we said, okay, 4 phases is helpful. And now I kind of know what makes up critical thinking, but I still don't have enough detail to be able to march my way, figure out like, how do I grow and execute phase? And then what does synthesize exactly look like? And so what we did is we took this idea of milestones. And milestones, if you're on a journey, is like, okay, how do I know that I've gotten to, in this case, 2,000 meters, and then the next, 10 meters, etc. How do I know that I'm making progress along that? And so what we did is we came up with 5 milestones for each of the 4 phases that move kind of from left to right here. So you can see at execute, you start at beginner, which means, in that milestone is understands and can re-articulate provided instructions. And then you move to the right, you move to intermediate, progressing, advanced, threshold, and then you jump down to synthesize. Don't worry, one, you don't have to try to take notes on all of this right here, in part because I'm going to walk through each of these milestones, not the threshold ones, but the 4 for each. And also this roadmap here is contained in the toolkit that you were given a link to download. So you can also have a copy of this. So don't worry about like scrambling to copy it down. So what I want to do now is basically walk through each of these to give you a sense of what is contained in them, so that you kind of get a sense of, one, I want you to be thinking, okay, where do I feel like I am strong? Where do I feel like I have some areas to grow? And then also, to the extent that you all are managing other people, you can be thinking about that for them as well. Okay, I'm just going to take a quick look at the chat. So it looks like, all right, let's jump into this. So execute milestone 1, understands the assignment. So this is, again, it can feel really simple, but in pretty much every time I've run our 12-week program, people have problems here. And that means that if I ask you to do something, that you actually understand what I meant. And there's a few tools that we use to teach people that, one of them, for example, is called the rearticulation test. And basically it means that, okay, if I ask you to do something, that you repeat back to me in your own words what you think I asked you to do. And you might be like, oh, sure, yeah, no, that sounds pretty simple. What I want to emphasize to you today is that a lot of the improvements in critical thinking, and this is true for people management, it's true for productivity, are not driven by large kind of brand new ideas. It's actually driven by doing simple things, but doing them repetitively and doing them consistently. And so if you're like, oh, that's a simple idea, well, I'd ask you, do you do it? And so that's the challenge, right? Like, is that most of us, we aren't doing the practices, even though like it doesn't strike us as novel. So don't necessarily gravitate towards like, oh, I need a novel idea, new, or like something that sounds brand new. I just need to acquire my tool set and then use them consistently. And so the first milestone here is understanding the assignment. The next milestone here is about comprehensiveness, so that it is basically, okay, do you do everything that was asked of you? One of the, kind of pet peeves of most managers is that they ask someone to do work and they, let's say in this case, ask for 4 things and the person comes back with 3. And you're like, oh, well, what about this? And the person's like, oh, sorry, yeah, that kind of fell through the cracks, right? You need to, in the execute phase, you need to be able to be comprehensive, not let things fall through the cracks. And so we talk about using checklists. We talk about completion processes here that basically take the job of remembering what needs to be done out of your mind and puts that into a system or tool that you can rely on and depend on, so that you don't have to just trust your own memory and recollection of what's being asked in order to be comprehensive. So that's milestone 2. Here. Milestone 3 is about the quality of your work. So this is very core to doing anything, any type of work is, okay, can I deliver the work at a high enough quality level? And so here we talk about a few different things. First is that you need to know this black line here represents, let's call it the meeting expectations line of quality. And you need to, as an employee or leader at the firm, you need to know what is the line of acceptable quality that meets expectations. And when someone starts new, one of the main challenges is having them internalize that. So I need to learn, what does it mean for this to do quality work? And then I need to go just slightly above that. So I want to overshoot the external quality expectations of others by a little bit, because that will keep you safe, so that 90% of your work, or 95 or 99%, is at or above quality expectations. If you try just to hit the quality expectations, then that means that sometimes you'll be below. So part of doing quality work is figuring out how to be a student of successful work, learning and internalizing that line there. You need to get that line written into your mind of so that when you look at your work, you know if it's meeting the quality standard or not. And then the next part of doing quality work is, if you have that line and you're realizing that you're below it, how do you improve? And there we talk about a practice called deliberate practice, which is, when it comes to people developing expertise, it's pretty much the most scientifically validated process for growing and developing expertise. And it's a certain way of building mastery, which I won't go into now, but just to foreshadow that of like, okay, if you do find yourself below the quality level, you need to identify the specific point of your weakness, and you need to engage in deliberate practice around that so that you can drive yourself improvement in that area. So that is milestone 3. Milestone 4 is timeliness. So delivering work on time or before time, and basically beating deadlines or meeting deadlines. One of the the key starting points for this that I try to communicate, and this was dating back to when I was a manager in a consulting firm, and I use this to this day, is that one of my rules is for my teams is never let a deadline pass without communicating on it. Like, there are going to be times when you're going to miss deadlines. Like, that is true of everybody in any situation, but you should never let that deadline come and go without you having communicated to the people who are expecting your work that you were going to miss that. And so that's just a starting point, a starting principle that helps orient people to delivery of timely work. The next thing that we talk about here is what I call work planning, which is building a plan so that okay, what are all the tasks that are required for me to complete this, and then setting intermediate deadlines for each of those by starting at the end and working your way backwards. And so that's building a work plan. So then you say, okay, well, now I know for this project or for this campaign, these are the things I need to do and when I need to have them done. But the key to actually delivering on that is ensuring that in your day-to-day, you actually have the time needed to meet your intermediate deadlines. So a lot of people are like, oh, I have this deadline in 2 weeks from now. And, I know I have to get it done in 2 weeks, and that's great. And that's helpful. But then they don't actually plan into their day time to work on that. And then they get to a day or two before the deadline, and then they're scrambling, and they kind of leave it up to wishful thinking to hope that, like, oh yeah, I hope that I'll have enough time to get that done 2 weeks from now, rather than knowing. And the way you know is you use a strategy called time blocking, which is where you put time on your calendar to work on specific tasks. And so if I know, for example, that I need to deliver work in 2 weeks from now, and I know that's going to take me 10 hours, then I need to have 10 hours blocked on my calendar to do that work. Because if I don't have that time blocked on my calendar, I'm engaging in wishful thinking, which is where I'm saying, I hope I'll find the time. And what that leads is either to miss deadlines or it leads to burnout. Because what happens is you engage in wishful thinking, and then you get to, let's say you have 4 more work hours left before you're supposed to deliver this work, and it's a 10-hour task. And then what you end up doing is you have to work an extra 6 hours. You stay up till 2 a.m. getting it done. So I'm giving you some of the tools here of how you think about delivering work on time. So execute phase, right? 4 milestones here. We started with the idea of comprehension, meaning that you understand what is asked of you. Milestone 2 is comprehensiveness, meaning that you do everything that's asked of you, nothing falls through the cracks. Milestone 3 is that you deliver quality work. And the milestone 4 is timeliness, and meaning that you deliver work on time. Okay, you guys ready for phase 2? Let's go to synthesize here. So synthesize is really about identifying what's important, remember, and then making sense of that, and then communicating it in a way that it reflects that importance. So the first milestone is, okay, imagine this meeting, right? You're sitting through this hour-long meeting, and you might take, let's say, you're taking notes, which is awesome if you are, and you're taking notes, and you come out with 3 pages of notes. The first milestone is about looking at those 3 pages of notes and saying, what are the 3 most important points, or the 4 most important points, or the 5 most important points, 5 most important takeaways that you want to leave with. So that is what milestone 1 is about. It might mean that you're sitting in a meeting, right? And you have 20, well, let's just say for simplicity, you have 5 people in the meeting, and people are talking about this and that. And then you're able to say at the end of the meeting, hey, it looks like we're saying 3 things, or it looks like we have 3 next steps. That's what milestone 1 is about. Milestone 2 is about figuring out what is not important. So you might have said, okay, there's actually 6 takeaways here, but then, when you present them to, let's say, your client, your other stakeholders, your superiors, they're like, actually, those two things aren't important, or they just don't care about them. And so step one is about identifying what is important. Step two is about weeding out what is not important. And here we talk about, particularly when writing, for example, writing emails or creating slide presentations or writing a memo, that it can be helpful to engage in what I call a systematic culling process, which is where you develop a system for cutting back and shrinking the information that you're presenting to the most important information. And so I like to share this example of I write articles for Inc. magazine, and early on in my tenure of doing that, I got feedback from the editor once that was basically like, you're far too wordy and you're creating too much work for our editors, so you need to figure this out and improve. And I was like, oh man, that hurts, you know. So what I did is I said, okay, I'm going to write a draft, and usually for Inc. it's about 650 words is what you're going for in terms of article length. And so I said, I'm going to write a draft, and then I'm not going to submit it until I've cut 25% of the words. And so say I landed at 800 words, I would then work on editing that until I got it down to 600 words. And that was a forcing mechanism for getting me to take out what was less important. It doesn't mean that it wasn't important, right? It just means it was less important. And if I had just said to myself, okay, you need to edit better and you need to cut out words that are not important, that would have been hard. But by quantifying it and making it a system, that enabled me to be effective in doing that. Fortunately, I didn't get that feedback again. So that's milestone 2. It's weeding out what is unimportant. Milestone 3 is saying, okay, well, we have, we're left now with these 4 important takeaways. How would you order them and prioritize them? It's one thing to identify what's important, but still you have 4 things. If you have, 4 ideas, 4 campaign ideas, there's a fair chance that you're not going to be able to do all of them in this quarter, for example. So how do you figure out which one is most important there? So that's milestone 3. And then milestone 4 here is about communicating. And there's a lot to say here, but well, the main challenge in most people's communication is that there's 2 things that we communicate. We communicate process and we communicate the answer. And remember, critical thinking is providing a robust answer to a question. What happens is, so by process, I mean, I tell you what I did. So if I were to say, I put together these slides and I did some research on this topic and I interviewed these people. And what I found was that there's 4 phases for the critical thinking roadmap. So I just started by telling you my process, and then I ended with the answer. That's called answer last communication. What I want to do is answer first communication, where I tell you the answer, what you're looking for first. And then I offer to explain the process if you care. But most often, unless the process is the answer, which is an exceptional situation, which let's put that aside for now. But if you don't care about the process until you know the answer, right? I don't care how you did it until I know whether the answer that you're telling me makes sense to me. And because if the answer doesn't make sense, then I'm going to be like, oh, well, how did you get to this? But if the answer makes sense to me, then I might be like, okay, that's great. Sounds good. Let's go. So this final milestone is about taking your understanding of what is important and flowing that into your communication and there's much more to say about this. We're going to hopefully get to some points around this as we go further, but at the end. But the thing that I want to leave you with right now is this idea of answer first communication, critical. And remember that I talked about how critical thinking is the headwaters. It's the source of good communication. So the more that our thinking is oriented around providing a robust answer to a question, the more that our communication will flow from that in a way that makes sense. Okay, I see a number of things in the chat here. Let me just check this quick to see. Okay, it looks like those are more. Yeah, the one question I'll just answer here quickly is that these are meant to be blank. It's just illustrative. I'm just trying to give you a sense of without bogging down in actual words of kind of what we're visually depicting what I'm describing here. Okay, so let's keep moving. We'll move on to phase 3 here. Okay, so phase 3 is all about providing recommendations, providing robust recommendations. There are a number of different words we could use to say this differently. We could say making decisions, evaluating options, deciding on criteria, providing an answer, so this is kind of the heart of critical thinking, providing the answer, the robust answer. So the first milestone is, and this is another one of my rules. I told you about my deadline rule, which is, never let a deadline pass without communicating. My other rule is never ask a question without providing a recommendation. And if you're a manager here, this will change your life. I'm not even kidding, because what happens is, how many times as a manager do people reach out to you and say, what do you think we should do about this? Or I'm stuck here. I don't know how to move forward. What should I do? Or, this person called and had this problem. What do you think we should do? So that is kind of the normal life of a manager, is responding to those types of questions. When that happens, a few things happen, basically. The first is that it takes the manager a long time to respond. And so most of their work becomes very reactive rather than proactive, critical thinking, strategic thinking, because you're just responding and answering questions. The other thing is that it creates a dependency of your team on you so that they don't engage in independent thinking themselves. And also it shields you from being able to see the quality of their critical thinking and then provide feedback on it. So the first thing here is to always provide a recommendation. So there's a structure to that, which I'm not going to get fully into, but basically, if I have a question for you about what we should do, say we're stuck, we've engaged in this marketing campaign and it's not working. I might say, hey, our conversion rates are down. We're below what we'd expect. We need to make an adjustment. I'm not sure which adjustment to make, but here are 3 options that I think we could take. I think we should go with option 1 because of these 3 reasons. What do you think? Does that make sense? Are you good to move ahead with option 1? As a manager, it's much easier to react to a proposed recommendation than it is to generate one on your own. And so that saves tremendous time for the manager. And it also puts the team members' critical thinking on display so that the manager can say, you're thinking about this amazingly. This is excellent. Or they can say, actually, you're missing a key part of how we should be thinking about this. And it enables them to coach them on the critical thinking. Okay, so milestone 1 is always provide a recommendation when asking a question. Milestone 2 is thinking about the weaknesses associated with your recommendation. A lot of times we provide a recommendation and then we present it and it gets all these holes shot in it, right? And we're like, oh, we should have anticipated those weaknesses and then mitigated those weaknesses and identified ways to strengthen them, or realize that the idea wasn't actually good. And so milestone 2 is about anticipating the weaknesses. I call it making the case against your recommendation. Part of your process, if it's a big decision, not if it's like, where should we go to dinner tonight? But if it's a big decision, you should deliberately make the case against your recommendation so that you can figure out, if I were in the eyes of someone else trying to do this, I would know what they would say to poke holes in my recommendation. Milestone 3 is coming up with alternatives. These 2 arrows pointing in this direction represent alternatives. And so here, it's very easy to get tunnel vision, be myopic about once we land on an idea, we're like, okay, we should do this. But if we haven't at least considered any alternatives, we're likely missing things that will either strengthen our original idea or that will be better and superior ideas. And so I go by the rule of 3, is always come up with at least 3 options. And the reason I say that is because if you come up with 2 options, a lot of ideas have kind of, they're on a spectrum, right? So there's one idea that represents this kind of end of the spectrum, which is like, okay, we need to grow by, being broader. We need to open offices all around the country, et cetera, like it's a breadth growth strategy, or we need to grow by being deeper. So go with our existing clients and expand business within there. So that's kind of two ends of the spectrum. But if you only limit yourself to two ideas, you're probably operating on this one line continuum here. And by doing three, it forces you out of that mental model and into some new space. And that's what we're trying to get to here. So milestone 3 is about providing alternatives. And we have tools that basically lead you through the process of generating alternatives. So it's not like, oh, let me just think if I can think of another idea. No, like there's a specific process that you can go through to come up with these. And then milestone 4, represented by this brick wall underpinning the recommendation here, is basically puts the bold in the robust part of providing a robust answer to a question. This is about making sure that your recommendation is sound, it's robust, it makes logical sense, it is comprehensive, it's not insufficient or missing pieces. So that is recommend. It starts with always providing a recommendation when asking a question, then moves to making the case against your recommendation so you can identify where there's weaknesses. Milestone 3 is identifying alternatives, and milestone 4 is really providing a robust rationale for your recommendation. Okay, let me take it. All right. Let's move on to phase 4. Okay. Milestone 1 here is, and this one has a little bit of a different feel to it. So it's about applying generate in a few different types of contexts. So the first context is creative thinking. And this is, to use this as a metaphor, it's the example of, say you were in charge of transportation back in the late 1800s, right? And they're like, how do we figure out how to get people from point A to point B faster? So you might be thinking, well, okay, they're riding horses, so how do we, improve horse transportation? So that is linear thinking or incremental thinking. Creative thinking is about going from the horse to the car, right? It's coming up with something completely different that doesn't follow linearly or logically from where you are today. And so that's what creative thinking is about. It's about step changes. It's about leaps that you can't just look at what has been done. You actually have to look to new things. And we teach a certain process that helps you figure out how to basically come up with these novel ideas that don't flow logically, because we can easily get trapped in the benchmarking phase where we look at what others have done and then try to replicate that. That works if they've achieved what you're trying to achieve. But if they haven't achieved it and no one's achieved it yet, then that won't work and you'll actually get you stuck. So if we apply the tools of recommend when we have a situation that demands generate, we're going to fail. And so this is about moving into a new space of where you're coming up with the idea of a car when you were asked to think about how to make horses faster. Okay, problem solving. And I probably should change this example because it's not meant to be political in any way, but I created this long before COVID. But it was basically the idea of like, okay, you have a problem that isn't easy to solve. I mean, COVID in a sense, was like this, where it's like, okay, how do we solve this? And you fit, in this case, the example here is like generating a vaccine or, other solution to that situation. And so this is where you have a problem and there's no obvious solution. And how do you come up with a solution in that situation? Okay, and then milestone 3 is strategic thinking. So we've talked about how do you generate a completely novel idea. We've talked about an intractable problem where there's no obvious solution. And then strategic thinking is, the strategy is how do you get from A to B, right? It's the how of getting to the destination. And so if you think of this illustration of a hiker trying to get to the top of the mountain, there are multiple ways to get to the top of the mountain, at least theoretically, right? But what's the best way to get there? And so strategy and strategic thinking is about identifying what is the right way to get there. And so that's also contained in the generate phase here. And then finally, milestone 4 is about taking a vision and communicating that in a compelling way and communicating that in a way that helps translate the vision into an actual plan and actual actions. So it's basically the translation process of going from vision, which is contained in those previous 3 steps, and taking that into into something that can then be acted upon and executed upon. Okay. So we have just gone through the 4 phases, 16 milestones. I know that's a lot, but what I want you to do now is I'd love for you to enter into the chat which one, if you had to pick one now that you would like to focus on, learn more about, grow in, which milestone would that be? And actually, I'll jump, let's see here. I will jump to this slide to give you that as a reference. Let me make this smaller. And would love, just drop in the chat there. Okay, I see someone say recommend, and try to pick even a specific milestone if you can, but phase is good too at this point. Anyone else have an idea? Good, how do you understand what the real issue is? Yeah. Problem solving. Okay, great. So we're actually going to talk, we're going to come at it, we're not going to come at it from the problem solving lens necessarily, but what we'll talk about will hit on that. So let's, feel free to keep dropping them in there as we're going. So what I want to do now, I'm going to skip over a little bit of section there, and I want to talk about how do you provide robust recommendations and actually give you some tools here to do this, which will, for those who are saying the recommend phase, this is great. For those who are saying problem solving from phase 4, there's parts of this that will be particularly relevant as well. So this is what let me hide the chat there. This is what we're trying to achieve. Remember, milestone 4 is providing a robust recommendation. You can see that's where we are on the roadmap there. So, I talked about always providing a recommendation. Well, how do you do that? If you're like, I have the question, how am I supposed to come up with the answer, right? Well, I want to give you, and part of what I just skipped over were some slides that basically said, if I have a situation like where, okay, I have a question and I need to come up with an answer, or at least a proposed answer, what most people do is they go through a thought process that is completely subconscious to them, meaning that you don't, if I were to ask you, okay, what is your thought process? What process do you engage in to come up with an answer to a question that you don't know the answer to? You probably would not be able to tell me. And if you somehow had some recording device of your brain's thoughts, and we were able to print that out for every situation that had that same type of characteristics, what you would probably find is that the process that you use in one time is different from the process you use here, different from the process you use this time, and so on. And so what we try to do in critical thinking, and the way you get better at critical thinking, is that you take a standard structured process, and then every time you encounter that situation, you use that process, because then you're making explicit and conscious how you're actually doing your thinking versus it being subconscious. And so what I'm trying to give you are tools that you can use to make how you think explicit, because most of us don't know how we think. We honestly don't. It just happens, right? And if you don't know how you think, then how can you teach someone else to think, right? So if I make it explicit and I know how I think, 1, I can get better at it. And then 2, I can actually teach other people. And some people are like, but that limits creativity, right? No, because the reason it doesn't is because I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you how to think. I'm giving you a process, and that actually frees your brain and positions your brain to engage in more creativity. And we're using specific processes that actually, creativity is often about the combination of ideas. And so it's actually facilitating that. If you just leave, a lot of creative people who are just naturally creative, they're leaving creativity up to chance, and I talked to someone who's essentially like worked for Google and Nike and branding and sees themselves as really creative. And, I was asking them about that, and they're like, yeah, basically I just kind of expect to come up with creative ideas. It's like, okay, that's a little scary, because what if you don't, And so, but if you have what I'm trying to do is create a structured process that will facilitate that thinking, that then you can get better at it and then you can teach other people. So when it comes to recommendations, let's jump in here. Let's say that you're, and I don't know kind of all the types of context in which you're operating, but let's just say that your boss comes to you and says, your job is to figure out how we can increase revenue by 5% next quarter. And you're like, okay. For some of you, you might be like, okay, I have like 3 ideas immediately, which is great. But what is a structured process you can use to respond in that situation? Well, I want to give you a framework. This isn't a beautiful acronym, but hopefully it'll stick with you, which is POCS. When you have a problem or a question or assignment that demands critical thinking, I'd encourage you to frame it in this framework of problem, outcome, cause, solution, and frame the assignment as a problem. Because you might say, well, that's not a problem. It's just increasing revenue by 5% next quarter. Well, what I would say is, if increasing revenue by 5% next quarter actually requires an assignment, like if it's not just going to happen, then there must be something that is keeping it from happening automatically. And that's the problem, right? So it doesn't mean a problem in kind of a specific sense of the word. I'm using that term more broadly. But if you can frame it as a problem, then you can begin to tackle it in a structured way. So let's say, okay, the outcome is increased revenue 5% next quarter. The problem is new business has dropped by 10%. Okay, so then the next step, which is, okay, how do we begin to come up with a solution to this? And you want to avoid jumping to a solution right now, because if we jump to a solution right now, we might be solving for symptoms rather than causes. And if we do that, at best, it will be a short-term fix, and at worst, it will create more problems. So we want to identify the cause. And here I want to give you a tool called the Fivewise Tool. Jeff Bezos talks about using this tool, and it's a very simple tool, but it's powerful. And it basically is that you ask, why is something happening? And then you answer that. And then you ask yourself, why? Well, why is that then happening? And then you answer that, and then you keep going. It's like peeling back the layers on an onion until you get to the core. And that's what we're trying to get to. That what is that root cause that is at the bottom there? So I'm just going to give you an example. I'm not a marketing professional. So if you're like, your answers are stupid, like that's fine. I'm just trying to illustrate, kind of how you would walk through the process. So you might say, why has new business dropped 10%? And then you could say, well, incoming leads have fallen 25%. And then, so that's the first why, right? Second why is, well, why have incoming leads fallen 25%? And you might say, well, we published fewer articles and did fewer interviews. Okay, so around content marketing seems to be the problem. And I'm making these answers up right now, but if you were actually doing this, you would want to actually do analytics to understand, like, is that true? Like, look at the data, right? You don't just make this up, but for the sake of this illustration. So then you'd say, why did we produce less content? And again, here I'm saying our senior leaders were more focused on growing business with existing clients. Okay. Why were our senior leaders more focused on existing clients? They were worried that we could lose existing clients if we didn't find more ways to serve them. And then finally, why were they worried we would lose existing clients? Clients expect more senior attention than they did previously. Okay, so see the level of depth of understanding that you now have of this problem versus incoming business dropped 10%. Now there's this richness of like, you actually understand what is going on because you've peeled back the layers. You could have come up with 10, 20 different ideas for how to increase incoming business, but they might not have been at all related to this fundamental problem that exists here. So one thing I will say is that there's no magic in the number 5. It's kind of just a rough estimate of what it usually takes, the number of layers. So you might find yourself getting the 3 and being like, I think I'm at the core. Or you might find that it takes to going to 7. So don't get caught up on the 5, but that will, so that then gives us a cause, right? Reduced ability to execute content marketing. Once you have a cause, most people can come up with a solution based on that cause of like, okay, well, when, in this case, so let me ask you here to put in the chat, what would be, given what I just laid out of the 5 whys and the cause there, what would be a potential solution? So put it in the chat as you're going. I'm going to kind of keep going because I know we're running short on time here, but you know, you could come up with a number of different ideas. What we want to do is frame our idea as a hypothesis. And here's a structure for providing a recommendation. I call it the HAE structure, HAE. And basically, it's that you want to come up with then a hypothesis for the solution. This is what I think the solution is. And then you move to the next layer, which is assertions. Assertions are, and I'll say this slowly because this is really important, is assertions are what would have to be true in order for your hypothesis to be correct. I've put 3 here. It doesn't mean that there will always be 3. There could be 5, there could be 2. That's just illustrative. But what has to be true in order for your hypothesis to be correct? And then under each assertion, you want to say, well, what data, evidence, qualitative research, interviews, etc., do I need, focus group, you know, do I need in order to prove that that assertion is right? So we're going to very quickly go through this this example. I think some people might have put put some hypotheses in there. Great. So I put this hypothesis: giving senior content producers dedicated content allocations, so time to actually produce content, and adding more senior capacity on the content production team will drive revenue growth by 5% next quarter. Because remember, we're going back to our outcome. We got to keep our outcome in mind. So now I have a hypothesis of what I think will work to do that. And then what I need to do is I need to come up with the assertions. So what would have to be true for this to be right? I'd encourage you to think about that. For the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of run through the examples here that I came up with. So 1, senior content producers can dedicate time to content production without hurting other revenue generating business. Like, that would have to be true in order for this hypothesis to be correct, right? Because if we give them, if we take some partners and we say, okay, you have to spend time on this, but then it hurts, you know, it drags down revenue elsewhere, then you're not going to hit your 5% revenue growth target. We also need to believe that we can actually bring on new senior capacity to our content production team. You know, whether that's actually finding someone who's qualified or being able to hire, et cetera, or we have the financial resources to do so. Assertion 3 is that creating some more senior level content, so producing more content, will actually increase incoming leads. And I had, you know, by the 25%, that was the number that I referenced earlier. And that when we actually increase incoming leads, that those will actually turn into revenue growth, okay? So you can see the flow of logic and thinking here. And going through this process of saying, here's my hypothesis and here's my assertions, forces you to be structured in your thinking and provide a robust answer there. What you would do next is layer on, okay, what evidence do I need to prove each of these assertions? And then you'd go out and you'd collect that evidence and see, is that assertion right or wrong? And if your assertions turned out to be wrong, then that probably means that your hypothesis is not correct and you have to go back and revisit your hypothesis. So this is a you know, a tool to get you to be able to come up with a recommendation in any situation. So remember, going back here, we have problem, outcome, cause, solution, using the 5 whys to come up with a cause, and then using this HAE recommendation structure to come up with a robust solution, excuse me, that has real weight behind it. What you would do next is then you would come up with alternatives, which are the arrows here, and you'd make the case against and figure out where it's weak. So that is a quick illustration of applying some tools to delivering a robust recommendation when you are asked a question and you don't know the answer. Okay. Let me make a quick point about communication. I think someone said the synthesize was an area of interest for them. So this was milestone 4 in the synthesize phase. And here is what most communication is like. So people are talking and they're just, or writing, and they're just throwing out all this information at you. And it's like a sea of different data points and stories and anecdotes. And it's just like a mess of people where you can't really make any sense of it. What you need to do in your communication is you need to impose structure. The two S's of communication are structure and story. I'm not going to talk about story today because we don't have time, but when you think about communicating, you need to have structure. And this is a quote from Charlie Munger. He's kind of like the number 2 to Warren Buffett. And he says, you can't really know anything if you just remember isolated facts. This is isolated facts. It's all, if the people represented facts, it's just like a sea of isolated facts. So you can't know anything if you just remember isolated facts and try to bang them back. If the facts don't hang together on a lattice work of theory, you don't have them in a usable form. Essentially, he's saying the information you present has to have structure so that people can understand it and make sense of it. And what's beautiful about the Hay recommendation structure that I just shared with you is it provides you with a structure that you can use to communicate. So when you're communicating, you can communicate using this structure. And what you want to do is you want to use what I call layered communication. So layered communication is the idea that if you think of our information, and there's different layers of detail that are present in any type of presentation, for example, I want to communicate different layers one at a time. And so, for example, using the Hay recommendation structure, layer 1 is the hypothesis, layer 2 is the assertions, and layer 3 is the evidence. So when I'm talking about layered communication, what I want to do is I want to zigzag. So I want to communicate my hypothesis. It might be hard to follow this yellow line, then go down and communicate all 3 of my assertions. So I say, here's my hypothesis. Here's what I think will drive revenue growth 5%. Here are the 3 reasons why I think that's true. 1, 2, 3. Then I go down to my evidence and I say, as needed, I say, for assertion 1, here's why we think this is true. For assertion 2, here's why we think this is true, and so on. So you want to zigzag. The problem is many, many people actually do the roller coaster. So you don't want to do the roller coaster. I'm going to explain what that is. You want to zigzag. The roller coaster is this. You say, here's my hypothesis. One of the reasons why I believe that is true is, assertion 1. And here's all my evidence for assertion 1. I also think that, this is true because of assertion 2. And here's all my evidence for assertion 2. I also think, and you get the point, right? So you're going up and down, up and down. And remember what Charlie Munger said, you need to give people the structure so that they can organize the information. If I'm going up and down, I lose people in the details, and they aren't able to build the structure because I need to give them structure in layers. So I need to do layered communication. I need to do the zigzag. So as you're communicating, what you need to avoid is going down, and you need to go across first. So that's, a practical way to think about communicating. There's a lot more, obviously, I could say, but we don't have, we're actually over time here already. So let me leave you with one last thing. This will take, if I know some of you might have to jump, but I'm just going to leave you with a few quick questions to think about developing a 6-month development plan. So one is, ask yourself this question: how do you want your critical thinking skills to be different in 6 months' time? And just write like a short paragraph about that. Then say, for each month, say which skill, and you can pick specific milestones from the critical thinking roadmap. Which skill do you want to focus on? And don't do more than 1 per month. And sometimes you might want to do the same skill for multiple months. And then once you've identified the skill, say specifically, here is what I'm going to do differently. Because until you've identified that, you haven't actually figured out how you're going to grow. And then you need people around you to basically support you and encourage you to grow. And so you need 2 types of people. It can be the same person, but often it's not. You need people who are going to hold you accountable. You say, okay, I'm going to grow in this area and I'm going to do this differently. Who are you going to be talking with every 2 weeks to actually follow up on them and say, yeah, I did this, or I didn't do this, or I'm experimenting and I'm learning on this. And then you need feedback. So when you do it, did it work? Okay, what worked well, what didn't work? How do I get better at it? So you want to identify the people who hold you accountable and the people who will give you feedback, and build in a system, a regular process for getting that information. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. To summarize, we talked about why critical thinking is important. We talked about the 4 things you need to grow in critical thinking. You need a destination, you need a map, which we shared the roadmap. You need specific tools to get you from step 1 to step 2. And then you need miles or kilometers, you need practice, right? And then I shared the roadmap in pretty good detail. And then we talked about a few specific tools. And now you have the opportunity to basically take that and think about, okay, how do I grow in the next 6 months? I know a number of questions were coming up in the chat about links. So what we do is we offer an online course, which is at courses.zarvana.com. So there's a few other links that were older links that weren't working. So sorry about that, but it's courses.zarvana.com. We also do one-on-one coaching. And then you heard me talk about a 12-week program. We have other corporate workshops too. So those are kind of the 3 main offerings that we have in this area. So if you're like, okay, I want to keep growing in this area and I feel like I could use some help, those are some options for you. So I know we're over. Thank you so much for joining. I'm happy to stay on and answer some questions if you all have questions. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day and feel free, you see my email on here and the link there. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or anything.
Matt, that was fantastic. Thanks. I have so many notes here that I've compiled. If you're sort of thinking about, is this an exercise that you think sort of individuals should do on their own? Is it good for them to do as a group? If like, I see a lot of people on this list that manage teams within law firms and that sort of stuff. Would you advise them to kind of workshop it with their teams, or is it something that they should kind of do a one-on-one or independent?
Yeah, what we do with teams is we have people create their 6-month development plan individually, and then we bring them together and they share it and they talk through it and they figure out what are practical ways we can support each other on this journey. Okay,
perfect. And do you have a sense of like, where are the things that people, if they're going through this process, where are they most likely to slip up, or what have you kind of found that to kind of keep them on course and not to get discouraged?
The most common, and this is true of any kind of professional development, but the most common challenge, especially because in our full program, we talk through 54 different tools because we're trying to give the full tool set. The most common issue is that people try to do too much at once. So I actually review their 6-month development plan when you're going through a program. And inevitably, I'm saying, okay, that's way too much to do in 1 month. Take 2 months to do that. Take 3 months to do that. So the main thing is, what I always say is, it's better to focus on one small thing and ingrain that in a way that it will last for the rest of your career than to focus on 10 things and have it last for 6 months. So that would be my main encouragement. The other thing is you need to drive to specifics, because you're only going to change your behavior if you know specifically what you're going to do differently. And so what I encourage you, if you're like, oh, I'm going to communicate better. Well, how are you going to communicate better? What specifically are you going to do differently? And how will you know if you're communicating differently? So drive to specifics in terms of what it is that you want to achieve, so that you know if you've done that and you know if you're making progress. And I know, sorry, and I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I always have too many, but so I have one last one. But how do people go about figuring out where sort of on the continuum they are? And I know they can probably be functioning in multiple at one time, but is there a way for them to kind of assess themselves? We do have an assessment that I can share with you, and then you can send out to folks. So we do have an assessment that helps kind of identify strengths across that. The other thing I would say is get a copy of the roadmap, and then basically do a self-assessment and say, where do I think I'm strong? And then take it to peers or your boss and say, hey, what do you think? Where do you think I am? If you had to pick 1 to 2 milestones on this roadmap where you think I should focus on developing, which 2 would you pick? And see what they say, and then compare your answers across those people and see if there's a convergence there. Perfect. So I know we're sort of closing out. I mentioned you when we spoke. I thought this would be I thought you and it would be a great person to speak at partnership retreats, and especially with associate professional development and that sort of stuff too. So if any of our people here are looking for that you do a great job at your session and walking us all through how to think a little bit differently. So we really appreciate your time today. That was a great session, I think, for all of us.
And I just want to put a plug out to the next session we have is coming up at the end of the month. So we have 2 in March this year, or this month. It is from equity to inclusion, a panel discussion on how to bring about effective DEI initiatives. We have a great panel of speakers. We have Samantha Samuels, who is Manager of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at BLG. We have Susie Williams, who is coming over. She is National Director of Marketing and Business Development for Macmillan. Corin Lightning Earl, she's a lawyer. Oh, I'm going to mispronounce this. Wickhoughton Law and Governance Lodge in Alberta. And we have moderated by our very own Amrita Koshlar, who is Director of Marketing from Bennett Jones. That is on Tuesday, March 29th at the same time, 12 noon. Matt, honestly, this has been fantastic. I have so many notes and a lot of great information that you've shared, so we can't thank you enough. And if anyone is interested in reaching out to Matt, we will be sending out a copy of today's video with all his contact information in there, and definitely check out Zarvana and all the great resources and materials that he has there. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you all.